Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, good evening. My name is Michael Jasny, and I direct the Marine Mammal Protection Project of NRDC, a large international environmental NGO headquartered in the US. Like some of you, I've been engaged on ocean noise issues for many years, including through Game On and various other efforts. I'm here to provide a brief recap of day one, which hopefully will help organize what we heard yesterday and set us up for an engaging panel today. The immediate context for this workshop, as you heard from Leela and as many here will know, is the experience building phase in the IMO's action plan for underwater radiated noise from commercial ships. The 3-year phase has been underway since October 2023 and is presently scheduled to conclude next fall in October 2026. One important practical element of the action plan is the development of targets for vessel noise reduction, which can be used to inform underwater noise management planning by individual ships, as well as management efforts that member states may undertake. And that is where yesterday's presentations come in. What we heard for the most part were presentations on target setting of one kind or another. In fact, a variety of approaches that are currently being pursued regionally, nationally, and internationally. Now, the sheer diversity of approaches we heard about can be confusing, so I'm going to pull out a few themes now. Theme number one, there is no shortage of science for setting noise reduction targets for commercial ships. That was an observation that SevTap made yesterday, and I do think it's borne out by the breadth of presentations. There are lots of options for setting targets. Of course, what targets you set depend on what you're trying to accomplish managerially and on the resources you have available. And some approaches, as I think we learned, are more resource intensive than others. Theme number two, empirical vessel-based targets are available for most major types of commercial ships. For example, David described the targets that Canada has developed, which are based on empirical data from about 70,000 measurements of vessels transiting across an underwater listening station in the approaches to the Port of Vancouver. Canada's targets divide each of 9 vessel types, container ships, bulkers, etc., into quartiles, representing the 25% quietest vessels for that type, the median vessel for noise output in that type, and so forth, scaling for both speed and size. Or put simply, what these targets represent are different degrees of ambition within what is currently practicable for commercial ships. Vanessa showed examples of other large data sets of vessel noise measurements that Scripps Institution of Oceanography has compiled using opportunistic measurement off Southern California and in the Gulf of Mexico. And she showed how those measurements could be used to produce targets corresponding to the 10% quietest vessels, which is still more ambitious than what Canada has been developing. Importantly, with the advent of measurement standards from ISO, these targets appear translatable to other waters. We learned from orally that Canada's West Coast base targets were compared against another large data set of vessel noise measurements acquired from a deeper water site on the other side of the country. And it seems that those West Coast targets wouldn't require a lot of complex adjustments to apply on the East Coast. So these are potentially a very powerful managerial tool, and it would be great if the panel could discuss where these tools could be taken internationally. One obstacle to the implementation of vessel-based targets is what SevTap described in her presentation as isolated data sets. That is, at least some holders of URN data have confidentiality commitments that limit their sharing measurements at the level of the individual ship. And these are barriers that would need to be worked through if we want the benefits of sharing vessel-specific data beyond just the noise targets themselves. You heard Eric present a European model for sharing, well, not the measurement data directly, but performance indicators. That is, that would be happening through a voluntary certification program called the Noise Ship Index, in which individual vessels can receive one of 6 levels of certification from iron to diamond based on the effectiveness of their underwater noise management plans. So that is a vessel-based target setting. Let's move to theme number 3. Biologically based targets are also in development for particular regions and species. Indeed, biological targets are now required in Europe under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and EU member states are presently working to produce such targets for different regions and figure out how to achieve them in the water. Niels described the process that 9 EU member states are undertaking for the North Sea, considering the acoustic habitat needs of some 17 vulnerable species of marine mammals, fish, and invertebrates. Pursuant to EU Commission guidance, the objective will be noise sources such that no more than 20% of the habitat of each focal species is exposed to biologically significant levels of noise in any single month. So in other words, there's a noise exposure component, a spatial component, and a temporal component. From North America, Orla presented a Canadian effort fairly far along, but still in development, to set a regional noise target for a single species, a single endangered species of marine mammal. And she observed from this experience that a single species can have a number of biologically based targets, which may correspond, for example, to thresholds of interference with important functions like echolocation, or to the amount of quiet time available for the species. Now, as we heard from these presentations, biological targets can be responsive to the conservation needs of particular regions and species. But I think it's also clear that developing and applying them is far more challenging and resource intensive and more geographically limited than the other kinds of target setting we've discussed. We also learned that biological targets are not incompatible with vessel-based ones. In the Canadian approach that Orla and Orally described, vessel-based targets have been designed to apply broadly in many regions through underwater vessel noise management planning, while special biologically based targets would be left to provide heightened management in particular areas of highest concern. That brings us to theme number 4 on implementation. Incentive systems have proven effective in some ways, but not in others. We spent some time yesterday on the second panel talking about incentive systems as a potential driver of vessel quieting and about what types of incentives might work best with shipping companies. Some programs, like the Port of Vancouver's ECHO program, give financial compensation to offset costs that are particular to their region. For example, the cost of extra pilot time incurred through participation in the vessel slowdown, as you heard from Orla yesterday. But it was also instructive to hear from Vanessa that the Blue Whale Blue Skies program in Southern California began with financial incentives, but then realized over time that public recognition was more important and more persuasive to its participating ship owners. Clearly, these incentive systems are working to a degree. The programs we heard about yesterday along the west coast of North America, covering Southern California, Central California, Northwest Washington State, Southern British Columbia, are achieving industry participation rates of about 60 to 90%. At the same time, we also heard about what incentive systems have not yet achieved. For now, these programs have succeeded in building broad compliance with operational measures in particular areas, motivating companies to engage in slowdown efforts, for example, but not in driving broad adoption of quiet ship design measures, which tend to be a lot costlier. You heard Eric talk about a new effort to aggregate incentives for achieving higher ratings on the Pi-Aquo Noise Ship Index, and you heard Chris talk about assembling a business case for dedicated noise measurement based in part on financial incentives that might be amassed from different sources. What isn't obvious, or at least not obvious from yesterday's presentations, is whether incentives alone are sufficient to achieve high levels of uptake in the kind of target-based underwater noise management planning that IMO envisions. In other words, for ship design. You heard Chris propose that energy efficiency standards combined with some incentives for noise measurement may be sufficient to produce desired amounts of global URN reduction. You also heard Jesse say, by contrast, that meaningful noise reduction requires more attention at the design stage. The fact is that at the moment, relatively few vessels are taking on underwater noise management. And that may be a function not just of a lack of incentives, but of what SevTap in her presentation identified as limited integration into national and regional governance frameworks. So there's a lot for our panel to reflect on today. about how to translate the great work that's been done in some regions to other parts of the world, about how to overcome obstacles to vessel noise management planning, about the relationship between URN target setting and energy efficiency, about the operational and planning tools available for meeting targets, and more. And we have a great group of panelists to tackle those questions, along hopefully with some of yesterday's presenters as well. To facilitate this discussion, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Reagan Nelson, a senior oceans advocate at NRDC. Reagan has spent most of her professional life working with diverse stakeholders on challenging programs in ocean conservation, like endangered species and sustainable fisheries. And since 2020, she's focused on underwater noise policy in the US and internationally. And she'll probably already be familiar to a lot of you participating today. Reagan?
Thank you, Michael, so much. I just so appreciate your ability to distill out so much of what we heard yesterday. It was really such a rich and diverse array of presentations. And I just think that, you're one of the best people to really help us cut through and hone in on some of the really large key points and examples that were offered yesterday. So I'd love to have my panelists come on camera. And as Michael said, we're going to start out today with some discussion with our distinguished panelists. And then as we move further into the discussion, we're going to provide an opportunity for the audience to ask questions of the panelists. And then where it makes sense, we can also tap our presenters from yesterday to come on camera and add to the discussion as well. So our panel discussion this morning is really focused on, as Michael made clear, we've done an amazing job of bringing the process of setting underwater noise reduction targets into clearer focus. We've made tremendous progress over the last decade in coming up with various approaches and ways of thinking about setting targets. But there's still a lot of complexity. And so I think what we can do today with our panel is really start to dive into some of that complexity and hopefully add some increasing clarity for policymakers, for practitioners, and for others who are dealing with the nitty-gritty of trying to figure out how to actually make the ocean quieter when it comes to shipping noise. So in lieu of doing sort of a general introduction of each of our panelists, what I want to do is start individually with some targeted questions for each panelist. And in that way, I want to be able to provide each panelist an opportunity to talk a little bit about their depth of work on this issue, because each of them are very much engaged in the process of reducing underwater noise and thinking about the application of underwater noise targets. So I'd like to start with Sammy. So Sammy, you are the Senior Project Officer for Environment and Sustainability for the European Maritime Safety Agency. And in this role, you have a responsibility to support EU member states in complying with the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. This is a regulatory framework that requires EU member states to achieve good environmental status on a range of ocean-related objectives, one of which is underwater noise. So can you please spend a few minutes describing for the audience what the Marine Strategy Framework Directive requires of member states when it comes to underwater noise targets, and tell us a little bit about how you are supporting member states to comply with this directive and what you think the key elements that underpin this work are for successful implementation of this policy.
Thank you very much, Regan. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening to everybody. And thank you very much for the question as well. So if I may, Regan, I will start by giving a very brief introduction of EMSA so that I can set a little bit the scene. And I promise I'll be very short. So EMSA is a European Union agency which was set up in the early 2000s. And initially, really in response to some of the major safety and pollution incidents at sea or in European seas. But over the years, our mandate has grown significantly, and today we play an active role in supporting the EU's work on sustainability and environmental protection in the maritime domain. Importantly, EMSA doesn't make policy. I wanted to highlight that because that's the role of the European Commission and the member states. What we do is provide technical support to help implement and monitor those policies, of course, including environmental legislation like the Marine Strategy Framework Directive or MSFT. Now, under the MSFT, member states are required to achieve what is known as a good environmental status, or GES, across their marine waters. And this is defined through a set of 11 different descriptors or indicators that cover various pressures and impacts on the marine environment. And specifically, one of these, descriptor number 11, focuses specifically on noise and on underwater radiated noise. So I don't want to repeat what Michael has already said, but just to remind what the MSFT asks of member states when it comes to URN. So basically, it's about ensuring that noise levels from human activities, being in this case shipping, because in fact there's two sub indicators, one for continuous noise, so from shipping, and one on impulsive noise. So it's about ensuring that these noise levels from the human activities do not adversely affect the marine ecosystems. And this is where the concept of lobe, or the level of onset of biological effect, comes into play. Basically, it refers to the thresholds beyond which sound starts really to disturb a marine species. And the aim is to reduce the noise levels below this threshold and in line with an ecosystem-based approach. This thinking is not just reflected in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, but there's a number of different pieces of legislation and other strategies, such as the Zero Pollution Action Plan, which set out specific targets to reduce URN across EU waters and setting thresholds. So within this context at EMSA, one of the key ways we support this work is through modeling of continuous URN from ships. One example I will be talking about today is the work that we've been doing on the Navison project, which estimates underwater radiated noise from all types of ships across all EU marine regions. The value of this model really lies in its consistency, as it applies the same methodology and data sources across the board. So from south to north, from east to west, and really helps by applying the same methodology and providing the data sources across the board. It makes possible for member states to compare results between different countries and different sea basins as well. Now, I don't want to get too technical. Stop me if I am in this case. What the model does is combines information about ships, so very specific, like their design, their engines, their propellers, and so forth, with AIS tracking data. It calculates the noise of a ship, and it generates, the noise a ship generates as its source, and then models how the noise propagates through the water column. And this data can give EU member states some powerful insights. For example, they can see which ship types tend to be noisiest in their waters, where and when the highest levels of noise occur, and how things evolve over time. The model also includes a foresight element, which allows to simulate scenarios all the way up to 2050. In addition to this, we also support the European Commission in its work at the IMO. And so really focusing and trying to support the review of the action plan and the implementation throughout the experience building phase. So just to sum it up, what EMSA does is to support the implementation of URN related policies within the EU by providing, let me put it like this, harmonized and science-based tools and data. And at the same time, we help build knowledge and experience and share experience internationally through our technical support to the Commission at the IMO.
Thank you, Sammy. I would like to move to Michelle. Michelle, we heard both from David and Aurelie yesterday quite a bit about Canada's multiple efforts, ranging from your UVNER effort, which was focused on identifying and putting forward ship-based targets for underwater noise. And we've also heard about the project that Canada has underway to pilot underwater noise management plans with shipping companies. So given your role as the alternate permanent representative for Canada to the IMO, where you have been very deeply engaged in IMO's work on underwater noise, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the ways that you think Canada's work has value for the international community and for IMO's work on this issue.
Super. Thanks, Rian, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Nice to be here. So it's a great question and is really the impetus, I'd say, of a lot of the work that's happening at the IMO right now was part of, and as Aurelie said yesterday, we've built a multifaceted approach to our work in Canada. And a big piece of that was the work at the IMO and recognizing that if we're talking about ship design standards or any kind of ship quieting, we really needed this to be on a global standard, kind of recognizing that about 95% of the ships that call to Canadian ports are internationally flagged ships. So this has always been, so my previous role, I was responsible for developing the overall kind of framework for Canada's work on underwater noise. And it was kind of a nice progression moving over to the IMO and being able to continue kind of supporting that effort. But the UNMP, the underwater noise management plans, is actually a really good example of how member state initiatives can kind of help inform the work of the IMO. Everything that happens at the IMO is based on kind of proposals and input and examples and best practices and information that's presented by member states and partner organizations. So if we've tried something, if we've developed something that is working or that has the potential to kind of really move an issue forward, it's an opportunity to kind of demonstrate that within the kind of the work of the IMO and incorporate that on a global scale. So the underwater noise management plans was something, as Aurelie said, was initially part of our domestic strategy that we kind of brought to the IMO as an example of, you know, this is an example of an approach that can be taken more globally, does not need to be limited in any way domestically, but can be approached by fleets around the world. And was initially even part of our strategy. It was targeted to domestic vessels initially, but obviously said, you know, on a voluntary basis, it would be really great if all ships and shipping companies were using this approach. So we had trialed it domestically and working with BC Ferries in particular, for example, and asking them, they had, because they couldn't really participate in our operational measures, right? So we'd done quite a bit on operational measures, so slowing down, rerouting, moving vessels further away from particularly sensitive areas or important areas for the Southern resident. But for ferries, it was really challenging because if they slowed down, they were actually louder. So we had kind of engaged them in this process of, well, what can you do from a technical perspective? How can we look at how your ships are actually built and designed to quiet them? Because we obviously don't want them to be louder given their prevalence in that particular area. And asked if they would kind of take a first stab at this idea of developing a management plan. And it became the basis of the work that we are doing in that space, because that initial plan was very basic. As those who've looked at the guidelines, you'll see there's two templates. And that was done purposely following negotiations and the discussions in the Ship Design and Construction Subcommittee working group, because there was a bit of a recognition that there's some companies that are just starting out on their journey and there's others that are much more mature and advanced. So let's give them both a template so they have somewhere to start and don't feel like, well, we can't do all of that, so we're not going to engage. So we took that example of where BC Ferry started, which was a very simple plan of identifying, how do we baseline our fleet? What research do we need to understand where the noise is coming from? What opportunities are there? What's our kind of, what do we want to do in 5, 10, 15 years kind of thing? And their plan, if you look at it today, what are we? 6 years later, is much more mature. They've now baselined their entire fleet. They have a list of each vessel, kind of how old it is, what its maintenance schedule is, when it's expected to be replaced, and what that looks like, and what that means for their overall noise signature of their fleet. So it's really become much more sophisticated and mature as they've learned more and as they've kind of figured out what they need to do. So it really provided a good example and something that we felt was valuable to the international community, which is why it was part of our proposal for how we would actually kind of refine and revise the underwater noise, the guidelines at the IMO, and luckily others agreed, and that's what we have today in the guidelines as an example. So I think it's the same goes, with the work being done on targets. A big question obviously comes up of how do we actually develop a target? How quiet do we want it? What does it look like? And the more that, any country can bring forward in terms of, how they've done the measurements, how they've set the targets, what have been the challenges, what are the opportunities for improvement? It feeds into this discussion on a global scale of, if we are to set a reduction target globally, what are the things we need to be thinking about? What have we tried? What works? What have we learned within kind of each of these domestic contexts to inform that kind of global conversation? So I think, all these different, everything we heard about yesterday is, and this is precisely one of the reasons that, the experience building phase is a good opportunity to bring these things forward, because it helps feed that conversation. I know initially, even for us, when we were thinking, how do we figure out what a target is, right? And that's where this idea of doing the underwater vessel noise reduction target working group came from. Was we know that setting a noise reduction target in a soundscape is really challenging and was a little bit outside the purview of our particular department, but we can look at a source, and we know what the source is, and we can regulate the source, or we can manage the source of the noise. And that's why we focused on the ship itself and the source noise pollution, and not the kind of soundscape, because it was a very tangible approach. And that's what we've tried to do in terms of kind of the approach for our vessel noise targets. It doesn't mean that's necessarily the one that will be adopted globally, but given kind of the context we're working at the IMO, it's a good example of that's where our mandate lies, is within the ships itself, and what we can actually regulate or advise on or provide guidance on is the ships itself and how they're built and what the requirements are around their environmental footprint. So all this to say, I think all the initiatives that were talked about yesterday provide a really good example and kind of feed into that work, and can help form the discussion kind of post experience building phase of where do we go next? What have we learned? What are the gaps? What are we missing? Do we have enough information to establish some kind of a target for the different types of vessels that would be developing noise management plans or design standards if that's where things are going?
Thanks, Michelle. There's a lot there. We're going to come back to you and dig a little bit deeper. But I'm excited now to turn to Manuel. Manuel, we're very honored to have you join this panel. You bring several really important and distinct perspectives to this conversation. So you are a lieutenant commander with the Chilean Navy, where you're currently serving as deputy at the Marine Environmental Protection, Climate Change and Pollution Response Department at the Chilean Maritime Authority. You also participate in IMO negotiations as part of the Chilean delegation. You're based in the Valparaiso region of Chile, so you are, I think, the only panelist at the workshop. who is coming to us from the global south. And last but not least, Chile is a lead pilot country for the IMO's Glow Noise Partnership, and you're a key representative in that effort. So there's a lot to explore here, but I wondered if you could start off by sharing with us the efforts that Chile is making related to underwater noise reduction and how your participation in the Glow Noise Partnership is assisting in those efforts.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invitation to be part of such a distinctive panel. Today is a very special day in our country as well. As you can see, I mean, some of you might know, some others don't, but it's the Chilean Navy Day. So we have parades, it's a holiday here, and it has a lot of like emotional component for me to be here today. And underwater radiated noise from shipping or underwater noise in general, it's becoming like a major subject for our Ocean Conservancy as well. We have been working mainly with the Ministry of Environment and different areas and how to approach to underwater noise regarding both the vessels, the marine protected areas, but also different sources of the noise. And since we got to be part of, as a lead pilot country from the Glow Noise project, we have had the chance to interact and to gather more info from different stakeholders around the world, not only from the lead pilot countries, which has been a like invaluable tool for us to learn from them, from the lessons learned, from the experience, from different approach, both technical and operational, in order to try to develop our own national plan, strategy, and approach on a challenge that we need to tackle from a multidimensional and transdisciplinary approach, which is a major challenge indeed. So in general terms, my country, Chile, is in the south of South America, right next to Argentina, a little bit north of Antarctica. So it's quite similar geographically to, at some point, Canada in the south of our country, or the fjords from Norway or the Nordics, when it comes to geography and how to approach to the safety of navigation. But on the other hand, up north, we have the driest desert in the world. Most of 90% of our trade moves by sea. So our connection to the maritime industry is vital for the country and also for the region on a broader approach. We have since, like, let's say, since 2018, some voluntary guidelines to the reduction of underwater noise impacts on our biodiversity in 3 different areas of our country. Up north, 2 of them, and down south, 1 of them. And we're about to release a 4th voluntary guidelines for some specific marine protected area at the northernmost part of the beginning of our Patagonia, also in a fjord area. So the first lesson there that we have, or we could like share with all of the attendees of the workshop, is that we do believe that they are a good start for countries that don't have that much data to analyze in order to implement some achievable goals, is to try to focus on particularly sensitive areas that you might have identified in advance for maybe some specific periods of times where some like sensitive biodiversity might be affected. Let's say, for example, whales. So when you have enough data to evaluate when the biodiversity is moving, what kind of vessel traffic you have, you might focus on some specific guidelines, voluntary at this point, in order to be also sharing more information on the IMO experience building phase, to be able to aim a realistic focus for the entire world in order to future mandatory guidelines. And that's also a major challenge. We have been discussions with different countries of the region, for example. I will talk mainly on South America, and the general consensus is that the underwater radiated noise from shipping is a really important challenge that we need to tackle, but it's also an emerging problematic that not too many countries dominate or know about. So building capacities and after that developing capacities is also a major challenge for particularly the global south or developing countries. And we strongly believe that the glow noise might be the perfect tool to evaluate that on a first approach in order to keep building from it. And finally, I would like to share with you that on an operational perspective, we have evaluated also that if we separate the underwater radiated noise approach into long-term, let's say new vessels or from the ship designs phase, Medium term, let's say retrofitting, like change important parts of the vessel. That includes major investments. And short term, with the existing fleets, both domestically and internationally, if we focus on the existing fleets and the short term, there might be some particular challenge when it comes to, let's say, reducing speed in some particular areas like the fjords of our country, where slowing down below 10 knots might have other kind of implications, let's say for safety of navigation in some particularly narrow channels, or even for the emissions. Because if you go too slow, the emissions below the eco speed might also increase the emissions from ships, and we're trying to fight really hard to decrease those emissions. Just to name two observations that we have so far for some particular regions. Might be applicable for some others, but might be complicated to implement in some particular ones, like the one that I showed you. So I think that is important point to analyze and to kind of debate and how to do it, because future mandatory guidelines, it's supposed to be implemented by the member state on a larger scale, but the implications might be addressed not only nationally for each member state or regionally for some specific areas, but also locally for some specific or sensitive areas inside of each country, like the example that I'm just sharing. So I open the floor for everyone to discuss about it, but I would like to, that is what I would like to share with you all at the beginning of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. That was great. Ricardo, I'd like to turn to you. You are the technical officer with the IMO Secretariat. So we're very lucky to get some of your time. Thank you so much for joining. You work within the Maritime Safety Division, where you are responsible for IMO's ongoing work related to underwater radiated noise. So as we've heard yesterday and even a little bit this morning, there's been quite a bit of work done by IMO member states on this issue over the past couple of years. And so I wondered if you could just describe for us what that body of work entails and what the current status of that work is.
Thank you, Regan. And before dwelling into replying to your question, I will make two notes. One, to thank you for opportunity for IMO to be here at this event, and congratulate you already for your first day yesterday, which was quite interesting and full of relevant information. And the second note is to acknowledge the support that the IMO Secretariat has been receiving, in-kind support from Canada and the United States, without which the IMO Secretariat wouldn't be able to have the resources and the energy to proceed with the support on the important activities on URN. So Michelle is here. I take this opportunity to acknowledge all the support we've been receiving, which has been quite important. And in relation to the second note, to say that IMO, in fact, Michelle already introduced this aspect. IMO are the member states and the organizations that are in IMO. So Michelle is IMO, Manuel is IMO, Sami is IMO, and me, Ricardo, as Secretariat, we do provide the infrastructure, the technical support, and we hope in doing that we promote continuously multilateral negotiation on these important matters. And with these two notes and dwelling into the answering to the question, Regan, in fact, yesterday we got a good summary of how the URN topic has evolved in IMO over the past more than 10 years. And in fact, I would not cover all those aspects throughout these years, but focus on the last 2 to 3 years and how intense has been the development since the revision of the URN guidelines at IMO and its approval in August 2023. So it's quite recent. And this revision of the IMO URN guidelines was instrumental because it changed the instrument from a rather high-level document into a document with more specific technical provisions, with reference to standards, with a focus on the ship as a noise source, including the URN management planning with templates, indication of computational models and their relevance, and the different sections of the revised URN guidelines now represent a significantly robust development in comparison to the first version of the guidelines. And this is quite recent development if we look to the recent timeline. We're talking about 2023. Since then, the URN action plan, which is put in place as a guide to proceed with the IMO work on URN, the URN action plan, composed of 9 actions and more than 30 activities, is intended to put in place knowledge development and gathering of experience and data on URN policies, URN measurements, and field experience. And in the URN action plan, one of the important elements is the establishment of the experience building phase, which, as it was already alluded, we are halfway through this experience building phase. And in this experience building phase in particular, we aim to gather experience from implementation of the URN guidelines and getting information from studies, from application of methodologies, data gathering, that allows further policy development, notably in the range of further measures, including targets, including which areas of the guidelines need to be further revised and assessed. And in doing so, this experience building phase represents quite a challenging period of 3 years that we are going now. Will be further assessed for a possible extension of 2 more years. But of course, the great advantage of having this experience building phase in place is that we have allowed for the experience to run and to get information, to get feedback, to get input to further develop guidelines and further policy measures. But there are challenges, and the challenges are that no sufficient information is received on the different knowledge areas that we identify, that all the information is not collated and assessed adequately, and therefore, in a correspondence group that was established just early this year at the Subcommittee on Ship Design and Construction, this correspondence group is currently working on the development of an experience building phase assessment framework, which will allow to identify knowledge gaps in different areas that will in the future allow us, one, to assess whether we need an extension of 2 years for the EBP, but also to identify where we further need to assess and study areas where we haven't received enough feedback, where we haven't received enough input, and identify where efforts need to be targeted. The work of this correspondence group, of course, is instrumental for assessing the implementation of the URN guidelines, to assess and revise the URN action plan. And at this moment, member states and organizations are therefore engaged in the work of this correspondence group. In addition, we yesterday heard about interactions between energy efficiency and URN mitigation. We are preparing for a workshop on this matter, for the second workshop on this matter, to take place at IMO in October this year. Actually, I failed at the 2 times in November, 6, 7 of November this year. Right. Exactly. And for this workshop, we aim to continue the work on identifying the synergies between energy efficiency and URN mitigation, and hopefully to find a way to, with these synergies, that with the cross relation between these 2 different policy areas, to identify where the contributions can come from. So at this moment, it is quite a very active and busy period with respect to URN. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. That's great. So I just want to remind our audience that now that you have been introduced to the range of experience and perspectives from our panelists, that you are welcome to put into the question and answer panel any questions that you would like me to raise to them. But I would like to return to some of the themes that that Michael talked about this morning and that surfaced in your introductory presentations as well. And the first, Ricardo, actually, you gave me a really nice segue. I wanted to direct this first question to Sammy. So yesterday, and as Ricardo just mentioned, we spent quite a bit of time talking about the relationship between energy efficiency and the co-benefits with underwater radiated noise reduction that some and perhaps even many energy efficiency measures can provide. I know that EMSA has completed some really insightful modeling in this regard. So I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about how URN target setting fits into these types of scenarios, given that we may see some natural benefits in terms of URN reduction from adoption of energy efficiency measures. And maybe even to put a finer point on it, how can regulators sort of factor in these benefits while also considering their directive to achieve good environmental status when it comes to underwater radiated noise? Thanks.
Yes, sure, Regan. As I mentioned earlier, EMSA has been working on a state-of-the-art model that not only estimates URN presently and in the past, but really tries to anticipate how it might evolve in the future under different policy and technological scenarios. So what we've done was to build a foresight exercise that models URN projections for 3 symbolic years, these being 2030, 2040, and up to 2050, across all of the EU regions and all of the ship types. So we identified 4 scenarios and we have built these around the following 4 different pathways. The first one is a business as usual scenario. So, you know, what happens if nothing changes? The second scenario is one where we see the implementation of only greenhouse gas mitigating measures. The third one is looking at what happens if we only implement URN mitigating measures. And the fourth scenario is a combined greenhouse gas and URN scenario. So considering both technical and operational mitigations. Importantly, each of these scenarios also includes changes in ship traffic volumes as well. The 6 mitigating measures that we have included, greenhouse gas and URN, are speed reduction, which I'm sure you spoke about yesterday, more efficient propellers, quieter propellers, air injection systems, optimized hull forms, and an operational one which looks at hull and propeller cleaning. So what did we learn from this exercise? Under the URN scenario, where clearly noise mitigation is prioritized, we see a consistent decrease in sound energy density across all European Union waters. And, you know, I was very happy to see these results because some of the reductions, reductions in some regions reached up to 80%. So, you know, that's quite a significant improvement. However, and this is quite crucial, in the only greenhouse gas focus scenario, so again, where we only apply the greenhouse gas reduction measures, we don't always see the same benefit for URN. In fact, we have some regions where the sound energy levels slightly increase for some ship types. And we also know the reason for this, because some of the energy efficiency improvements, like the more efficient propeller, can actually raise the source noise levels despite reducing emissions. This is what also Manuel alluded to before. If we take the fourth scenario, which is the combined scenario, so where both climate and noise objectives are considered together, again, I'm very happy to see that the URN levels really continue to decrease significantly through 30, 40, and 50. The maximum reduction that we found in this case was specifically in the Mediterranean Sea basin, and it was up to 70%, which is, still quite a large percentage. So you asked me how is this, relevant for regulators, or how can it be made relevant for regulators? Well, I think, in my opinion, the key takeaway is that we can assume there will be many co-benefits between energy efficiency and quieter ships, but we have to note that sometimes there can be also trade-off. So when looking at URN target setting, we really need to be intentional and build on clear understanding of these interactions. So, not just say, yeah, let's not worry because the greenhouse gas will anyhow reduce. I would also argue that regulators aiming to meet the requirements of quieting both the ships and RCs should be able to have the ability to incorporate these predictive modelings or the outputs of these predictive modelings into their decisions. It really allows them to understand which measures truly contribute to noise reduction and where, in other cases, extra work or effort might be needed. But I also think, and I would like to hear the opinion from the other panelists as well, that it also underscores the importance of having a holistic policy approach. And here, what I mean is that where climate and environmental goals are actually addressed together. So I don't know if I was to use a maritime lingo. I think these foresight exercises may give policymakers really a useful navigational chart, if you see what I mean, helping them to avoid, in some cases, unintended consequences, and really, in a way, ensuring that the path to carbon neutrality, which is a priority, is also a path to, quieter seas. And therefore healthier seas as well. So yeah, this is what I would like to share with you, and also hear the views of my esteemed colleagues.
Well, I do have a direct follow-up, but yeah, I would love to just open it up quickly if anybody wants to share some additional perspectives from Sammy's intervention.
I'll just jump in super quickly to say on your last point there, Sammy, I think that's exactly part of the impetus for really trying to push this along now at the IMO. We're at a point where, with the GHG strategy and the measures that were just approved at the last MEPC meeting, where shipbuilders, ship owners and operators are going to be looking to replace their entire fleet over the next couple of decades, right? This is a real opportunity to look at the holistic, what is the environmental footprint of the ship, and where can we ensure that we are not just fixing one and 10 years later when we come up with another standard on noise or what have you, that we have to kind of go back and reassess. Let's look at it as a whole now when we have an opportunity to, because there are co-benefits. There are very few that might be, what's the word I'm looking for? Not provide co-benefits, that actually have the opposite effect. So how can we ensure that we're prioritizing those approaches to design that actually see those co-benefits of reducing underwater noise, improving energy efficiency, reducing GHGs, improving kind of overall, addressing biofoul, addressing what are all those different environmental impacts and the impact on biodiversity and ocean health as a whole. So I think that's, even within the theme of the World Maritime Day event, UN Oceans is about, that kind of our ocean, our obligation, our opportunity. This is an opportunity to really look at it more holistically, and noise needs to be one of those pieces.
Well said, Michelle. I couldn't agree more. So the question I wanted to ask, following up from Sammy's intervention, is about this notion of intentionality and being intentional when it comes to, thinking about underwater noise objectives. And we spent, some time on this yesterday. And Ricardo, you mentioned that there's a forthcoming workshop on the relationship between underwater noise and energy efficiency for this November. But this is actually the second such workshop. And there was a previous workshop held in September of 2023, if I have my dates right. And, that was really, I think, one of the primary findings of that workshop is the need to be intentional about URN design in the context of our greenhouse gas and energy efficiency work. And so I wondered if you could just say a bit more about that finding, and in particular, how that plays into our target setting conversation that we've been having yesterday and today.
Thank you, Regan. Indeed, when the word intentional and intentional ship design with regards to URN reduction, it really looks into the process of ship design and having into account URN objectives from the very first steps of basic design in the early stages of ship design. When a ship is designed, usually the primary drivers are the payload, the service speed, the autonomy of the ship, but then an intentional ship design approach would also include URN mitigation as a primary driver in ship design. In the same way that we have now drivers for energy and space efficiency when you're designing a ship, also integrating into this aspects of URN mitigation. This is essential because from a capital investment perspective, it's better to start adopting these measures from the start when the ship is designed than making retrofits that may represent at a certain point an added cost to the ship. The different measures that are already listed in the revised URN guidelines are measures that are easily adoptable from an early design stage perspective. And this integrated holistic approach is indeed from the first workshop takeaways, one that was listed. Of course, some of the measures are also possible at later stages as a retrofit in a specific ship, but the options are more limited. Whereas if you take into account specific design options in machinery room design, setting and choosing the right propeller, because a propeller is directly linked, of course, to the machinery and to the powering aspects of the ship. The options are much wider in the beginning of the ship design. So this is having an intentionally quieter approach to ship design. This was one of the key takeaways from the workshop.
Great. So I'm gonna ask you guys what might be a little bit of a challenging question, but I think that's the point of these types of workshops, right? Is to kind of surface ideas, get some reactions to them, and kind of see where the conversation goes. So my question for you is, this workshop is very much about trying to distill out a process for setting underwater radiated noise targets. And Michelle, as you mentioned earlier, the purview of the IMO is really focused on the ships themselves, right? And so you know, Ricardo, you mentioned that we're currently in an experience building phase for the underwater noise guidelines, and the underwater noise guidelines, you know, recommend the development of underwater noise management plans, and as part of that, you recommend setting underwater noise targets or goals. So in the spirit of trying to advance the conversation around setting these types of targets, I'm wondering if we could maybe put out some benchmarks that could be useful for shipping companies, owners, operators, administrations to begin to test out and to see, you know, from a feasibility perspective, from a cost perspective, you know, what's appropriate for setting underwater noise targets. And so, you know, just kind of getting the conversation started. You know, what if we talked about benchmarks for existing vessels that aim to achieve at least a 5 decibel reduction with particular attention to frequencies below 1,000 hertz? And then having a separate benchmark for new builds where we aim to achieve at least a 10 decibel reduction with particular attention to those frequencies below 1,000 hertz, more of the low frequencies. And that would be relative, obviously, to like a traditional design or sort of a sister ship design. So again, just putting it out there, but would love to hear your reaction to having benchmarks at all. Is that a good idea? And are those numbers a reasonable place to start? I know I said it would be challenging.
Who wants to go first?
Ricardo.
I'll break the ice. How's that?
I can.
Oh no, Ricardo, go ahead.
Yeah,
You go
no.
ahead.
Well, I wasn't reminded to bring my crystal ball, so I cannot. While not commenting on the specific values, I think it's quite important that when we talk about setting targets, that we are quite comfortable about measuring noise levels, that we have the standard methodologies in place to measure, and that we heard yesterday how, for instance, for shallow water measurements, the ISO standards is being finalized. And I think that getting results from field measurements and assessing how comfortable we are with replicating these together with the use of modeling tools like SAMI just indicated that allows to provide for a thorough impact assessment on different policy options. I think this is a combination of these two things, which, of course, when we talk about targets, we immediately think they can be either regional targets, they can be specific area targets, they can be international targets, but then we really need to know what we're talking about. What are these targets about? If we only look at the ship and we consider that the noise, the irradiated noise from the ship is incremental to different regional targets, then this is an option. But really being comfortable and having member states and organizations agreeing on specific methodologies is quite important before starting to set in stone any targets. And I think this is something that where knowledge is evolving, and my colleague panelists will be surely helpful in adding to this. And I think the momentum right now is really to understand where we have achieved this necessary zone, where we have the knowledge on these elements, because it's really building blocks that need to be in place before setting standards. Because the URN management plan is a ship-specific plan, and to replicate this with a different approach, more global, let's say, approach is an exercise that requires a few steps in between.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, you know, I think that any work on sort of design standards obviously is going to be ongoing. But again, I'm just trying to see if there's a benchmark that we can aim for, right? That's useful for companies that are actually trying to make progress with their underwater noise management plans. What should we tell them to aim for? is really the gist of the question. So Michelle, I think you wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So a couple of thoughts here. So the whole idea originally behind the underwater noise management plans was exactly this, was to put the onus on the shipping company, the operator, the owner of the fleet, to kind of figure out how they were going to achieve these reductions. With a recognition that everybody said, okay, but how quiet are we making it? So to your point of what's that benchmark? And I think it is valuable. And I know in 2019, when we held the first work, so there was a workshop before the one in 2023, but this was kind of more on underwater noise in general, kind of when we were pushing or advancing the issue at the IMO to add it to the agenda. We had a discussion around targets. How quiet do we need it? And there was this recognition at the time of biologically relevant targets is really challenging because depending on where you are, different species are going to have different needs and different targets. But if we can kind of agree on a overall, the decision, or not decision, but the recommendation at the time was to kind of focus on the Okeanos targets, which were mentioned yesterday, the 3 dB in 10 years and 10 dB in 30 years as a bit of a benchmark to at least get people thinking about what do we need to actually be doing. And I know, for example, going back to the BC Ferries example, that's what they have put in their underwater noise management plan as their benchmark. This is what they're looking to achieve, is that 10 dB over 30 years across their fleet. And they might go more, that if they overshoot, that's fabulous. So I think it is an important discussion, recognizing that this is, what do we, if we're trying to give at this point, I mean, the guidelines are voluntary. This process is led by the companies themselves, with support from so many different, players, maritime administrations, IMO and others. But, setting something that kind of falls into, I think, that range there. I mean, you said 5 and 10, Reagan, like that, is kind of close. But I do think there's a value in that. And I think it is the outstanding issues, because everybody always just says, how quiet do we need it? So, for a starting point for a company, I think either looking at the Okeanos targets and kind of understanding what is in the kind of realm of the possible out in terms of technology, and doing it based off that is also a possibility. We've seen the example of Scripps, where their radical retrofit, Maersk, where their radical retrofit saw, I think it was a 7 to 9 dB reduction, based on their retrofit. So we know that this is possible. So, within the kind of type of ship that you have, how old is your fleet, kind of, and planning that out based on kind of what is feasible within the next, 5, 10 years kind of thing, I think is really important. So short answers to say is, yes, I think it would be valuable to establish a benchmark. Obviously right now that's done on a voluntary basis. Can we establish a voluntary benchmark within kind of the discussions at a global scale? Obviously, that would probably be better, because then it provides a bit of a global approach. But it also could be something domestic based on kind of certain priorities within, a particular countries or where they operate. So bit of a rambling answer, but
no, that's great. That's really, really good. Manuel or Sammy, anything you want to add?
Sorry, I forgot to turn on my microphone. Yeah, if it's possible, I would like to. I mean, I'm a football fan, so there's a term that is like when you grab the ball and you put it on the floor, kind of to put orders to the players. It might be like it's super important to have like a benchmark, but the first question that rises to my hand, based on what I've discussed with different representatives of delegations internationally from different countries, let's say Asia, Africa, South America, etc., is it do we have enough amount of information actually to make these kind of decisions or to approach it on a global scale? Or are we kind of trying to set up the baseline based on only information and approaches for some specific areas that might or might not be replicable for some others, if you know what I'm trying to point out. So, I mean, I will share one example of our country. We measure one specific marine protected area for about a year and a half, but we were only able to gather information for 17 weeks due to different operational material failures or complications with the weather, with the sound itself, with the pitches. So from a broader spectrum of time, we were only able to gather information for a short spectrum of time, but the information that we got was good enough for have a first approach on how we should kind of guide our efforts. Is this enough to kind of have a benchmark on how many decibels are we able to decrease or not? Maybe not. And that may be the unpopular answer, but also the realistic one that I would love to share. Now, on the other hand, there are regional concerns. I mean, we're getting closer to new challenge when it comes to marine policy itself. I mean, the VBNJ agreement might be agreed soon, and that might change the perspective for the high seas, for example. There are some regional organizations like let's say the South Pacific Permanent Commission that are also working in some regional programs like RAMPAS on how to evaluate marine protected areas on the high seas. And it's important to also measure the impacts and the implicances of all kind of eventual mandatory guidelines. If we think about the high seas, the speeds that you manage, the echo speeds, for example, from vessels might be different that you have in internal waters or territorial seas. So there are many question marks that might be arising in the next few years. And in order to set up the standards and the goals and the approach, I do believe that we might need more information for longer periods of times as well. That's my point of view.
Thank you, Manuel. So we have about 16 minutes remaining in the panel, and I guess I have to share this time with you, with the rest of the audience. It's been a real pleasure to be able to ask you all of these burning questions. But I want to turn to some of the Q&A that we have coming in. So, Sammy, a question for you. So when you were modeling the future URN reduction scenarios, where was the data obtained to quantify the URN reduction of different underwater noise or energy efficiency technologies?
Yeah, so what we did was we used as a baseline the AIS data, the ship design data, and the ship characteristics data for 2022. So we took that year as our baseline, and for each of the scenarios which I mentioned before, we generated the sounds maps by calculating the probabilities of each ship type adopting the mitigating measures that I outlined before. Within in a probabilistic way. And so what we did was we took it from there and we ran to 2030, and then we changed from 2030 to 2040 the amount of vessels and within this the different ship types that were going to adopt the mitigating measures and calculated once again the URN, and then thereafter we did the same for 2050. There is a report that I can share with everybody, is available on our website about all of not just the results but the way we did the modeling and where the data came from. For example, the way we calculated the increase in ship traffic was not something that we did on our own. We took the DNV report of 2022, I believe, as well. So the details of that are available in the final report for whoever is interested.
That's great. And as we wait for some more questions to roll in, I just want the audience to know that we do have the ability to bring back on some of our presenters from yesterday. So if you have a burning question that didn't get answered, we can certainly try to address that in our remaining few minutes as well. Sammy, I did want to ask a little bit. You had mentioned that you have some innovative work underway in collaboration with your European Space Agency when it comes to monitoring underwater radiated noise. So I wondered if you could provide us a little insight into that work.
Yes, sure. This is something very exciting that is happening as we speak. So while we were working on our modeling work, it became apparent that we were able to quantify or estimate URN for those ships that let me put it in inverted commas, that we see, so that they emit AIS information, and we were able to gather this. This means that some vessels were not included in this model, commercial vessels, but it also means that the soundscape that created did not include any recreational vessels. Usually closer to the coast, but in some respects could be even noisier. So we have a long-standing cooperation with the European Space Agency. We use satellite imagery for a whole wealth of information. For example, we use satellite imagery to detect oil spills on the sea surface, for example. But we also use satellite imagery to detect targets at sea. These targets might or might not be vessels emitting AIS, but they can be very small vessels as well. And from the information that we gather from the satellite images, we're able to extract a lot of information on the way they move, on their vibrations, going down to very specific details on possibly the wake that is created by the propeller. And so by gathering all of these characteristics, we're trying to really be able to have a way to not just validate the information from the model, but really be able to monitor on a very large scale without having prior information what is the URN at noise by using these signal characteristics that we can gather from space. So this is work that we have just started with our partners at the European Space Agency. We are also looking at some measurement campaigns to understand if what is detected from space corresponds to what is actually measured at sea. And we're very, very welcome for interested parties, being them ship operators, shipbuilders, or member state administrations to come and work with us on this. We have one shipping company who has agreed to cooperate, and so it's quite exciting being able to monitor on a very large scale URN from ships, from satellite is something new, and hopefully in the next years we'll be able to report and have some very true measurements that in this sense are global, because satellites don't only monitor one specific area, and so we'll be able to move throughout the globe.
Wow, that's really incredible. Michelle, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Reagan. So there's a really great exchange happening in the chat, not in the Q&A one, but in the actual chat about benchmarking. And I just wanted to comment on it very briefly, if that's okay.
Please.
Yes. Okay, good. Yeah, no, and it's a really important question. So the benchmarking and the point being that you need to have a baseline before you can, figure out what your target is on 100%. And I think that's been, when you look at in the guidelines and in the IMO underwater noise guidelines, it kind of sets out what are the steps you need to take. And one of them is figuring out what your baseline is. And I think I totally agree. There was a comment that we need to do measurements in other waters in the various ports where they might be calling, because it's going to be different based on the sea state, bathymetry, geography, all the different kind of things that impact what your noise measurement is going to be in a different place, which is probably, I'm going to say, your gold standard. And I guess I just want to say a little bit to my point earlier is that everybody's on a different point of their underwater noise journey. And if that means you've only got measurements from the Port of Vancouver or the Port of Halifax or the Port of Singapore, start there, right? And that's what the experience building phase is about, is using the guidelines and figuring out, can I actually go through this process? What are my challenges? How do I get my baseline? What is available to me to be able to determine the noise of my fleet, recognizing that it's going to change potentially, or what that noise signature is going to be in a different operating environment. But as Aurélie says in the comments, that the way the guidelines are written is your kind of standard operating state is to develop what your baseline is. So I think we do need to, when we think about it, is I think, especially those of us who've been working in this space for some time, we kind of jump to the gold standard. But I think we also need to recognize we need to help companies that are new in this journey of figuring out, how do we at least get a starting point? Where are we starting from? What is the baseline that I have? And how can I start testing these different approaches to achieve, a 3, 5, 10 dB reduction over time? One other comment I wanted to make was, because there's comment around, well, if you slow down, you're going to kind of reach that point. I think the goal overall is it's a short-term solution. And what we've been encouraging is looking at, operational measures only get us so far, and work in, as an immediate approach. But over time, a more sustained approach is to design quieter ships, right? So that we're starting here as opposed to starting here. So we're starting at a lower point, and then if there's a particularly sensitive area where we need to slow down to make it even quieter, then we can look at what those operational approaches are on top of that. So just something to think about in that noise planning process is, you have your short-term approaches, which will likely be more operational, but over time, how do we incorporate that into, retrofit of existing or design of new vessels? So just a couple of reflections on some of the comments in the chat.
Thanks for that. And I see that one of our organizers and presenters from yesterday has a hand raised. So I'd like to go ahead and ask Leela Hatch to come on camera. And
thank you, Reagan. And I just appreciate so much that, so we have been semantic a little bit here in bringing the word benchmark up now to add to our panoply of target, threshold, goal, objective. And I like it, but here's the reason I like it, because I think those of us who were involved in having a discussion in Hamburg all those years ago that has resulted in a still rich conversation about what we're after for ambient levels in the global oceans sees an opportunity. I see an opportunity again here to have a similar envisioning and categorization benchmark for the source levels of individual vessels. So that is how I might suggest that, a little bit separate from the phenomenal conversation happening in the chat, which I do think is highly relevant to target setting. It is the most relevant way to consider target setting. Benchmarking, on the other hand, would be an appraisal technique. It would be our ability to, as we did with the VARD report, looking over several hundred approaches, with a column in that report that categorizes those approaches as achieving a 0 to 5, a 5 to 10, or a 10 decibel and above reduction. What we heard yesterday is that we are still having a hard time teasing out categories 1 and 2. We know a couple things that we all keep referring to that are either zero noise benefit or a negative noise result. And then we sort of get into this wash of everything else, but the everything else matters deeply to how much intentional noise reduction we can expect. So I suggest, and I would continue to think that, Reagan, the question you asked about those categories is in fact quite deliberate and is not meant to replace any target setting approach, which could continue to be advised by these large data sets approaches to where our medians are and what's achievable by quartiles. This instead would be our way of honing in on the vessels for existing approaches that can achieve a 5 decibel reduction through existing measures. And what are those measures? What's that class that's actually giving us that benefit in that category, at least 5 decibels? And then where are we getting an at least 10 decibel, maybe only design advance? And that again is an after the fact appraisal, not replacing a threshold. So thank you for permitting me to if we introduce a new word, and I appreciate that we have, because it's been interesting to see the Okeanos discussion, and that is a little bit different than target setting, and the word benchmark I think is useful for us.
Excellent. So I see that we're coming up to the end of our time here, and I know at least Michelle has to leave right at the half-hour mark. So I think what I'm going to do now is just open it up to our panelists for any sort of final thoughts that you'd like to leave with the audience before we turn it back over to the organizers. And Michelle, let's start with you since you need to skedaddle.
Sorry, thank you, Reagan. Yes, apologies, I do have to run off. But this has been great, and Leela, as always, you are right on point. It is an important distinction that I think sometimes we start throwing out numbers and terminology and need to make sure that we're being purposeful in how we're using those. But I think it's a super worthwhile discussion, and I think parting remarks is this is a time that we're really encouraging companies and maritime administrations and shipbuilders and ship designers to be looking at those guidelines and trying to use them and figuring out, what are the gaps? What do we still need to understand? Do we have a standardized measurement that should be looked at? It's part of the action plan in the URN action plan as well. I think these are all things that we can be looking at and testing to see where we need to be spending more time and energy, or where more guidance is needed, or something else. So I hope people have enjoyed this, but it's been great. It's been great exchanging with you all, and I look forward to continuing these conversations.
Thank you, Michelle. Any other comments from our panel?
Can I jump in very briefly as well?
Yes.
It's been a very interesting conversation. I think we have material to continue for some time, but I just want to share some very briefly 3 key maybe reflections from my side in order to continue and really to take full advantage of this moment. The first one is based on collaboration. I see there's so many different actors involved. We mentioned a few in the panel, the shipbuilders, the operators, but the ports are part of the equation as well, the regulators, the classification societies, for me clearly the member state administrations, but also the local and the indigenous people, the research institutions. And I believe we really need to build an environment where they can all get together, not just to agree on the problem, because that is very clear, but also really to share the knowledge, and to focus on what we are working, which is quite a lot. Related to this, I think and maybe Manuel can be much more clearer than me on this. We really need to ensure that data knowledge flows freely, being it, if it's north to south, from developed to developing states. But from my perspective, it's also the other way around. It's not one way. Whenever I sit in a meeting with Manuel, I learn a lot on what is happening in Chile, is part of the global south. So I think really it's important to recognize that it's a global challenge, and it's not just the data information knowledge flow is not one directional. And third, it has been discussed clearly. The one of the priorities will definitely be to set clear and coordinated targets or benchmarks or whatever really we want to call them. But yeah, we have to really find a realistic but an ambitious timeline for building this framework together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sammy. Manuel?
Yes, firstly, I want to say that I think that Sammy was literally reading my mind, because I had some notes that I wanted to share, and it's exactly reply to your question. This is not only one way around, and my first announcement is that you can count on us, me particularly, but we are a team, in sharing the data that we have, the experience, the lessons learned that we might have, or the developing processes that we are conducting here, not only for the experience building phase, but also for the game on analysis that you may have, or any other kind of research that any one of the attendees might be conducting. Because we strongly believe that data sharing and experience sharing is the best tool to build and develop capacities. And this is way broader than only the IMO field game, I will say. It's also, I think that we do have consensus that the URN is actually a practical approach, understanding that the reduction of the emission from vessels and the reduction of the noise from vessels goes on the same direction, and that it starts from design. So that would be basically like a long to medium term approach. And on the other hand, we also have to find particular approaches and how to mitigate the consequences of URN in specific regions, areas, and countries as a short-term measure, more into the operational side of the analysis. This has been a great opportunity. I love the chat interactions. It's incredibly insightful. I took a screenshot of every single intervention on the chat as well to keep reading afterwards. And just count on us to keep building capacities. This is lovely, and I would love to keep working with all of you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Ricardo, we'll give you the last word.
Such a responsibility. But to say that I really enjoyed sharing the panel with the colleague panelists, and to say thank you for this participation from our side. And I would like to finish not with long statements, but just with two very practical notes regarding one, work of the correspondence group on URN, the IMO, and on the forthcoming workshop at IMO on the interdependencies between energy efficiency and URN mitigation. On both, many of the participants in this workshop may be wondering how can we submit or participate or share our work, our studies, or our ongoing research. This should be done through administrations, through your maritime administrations that are represented at IMO, or through international organizations that sit at IMO. Sometimes it's difficult to understand or to see what's the best path in order to submit or share relevant information with the work of the organization. So this needs to be done both for the correspondence group or for participation at the workshop on the 6th, 7th of November this year. Now I got it right. This should be done through the relevant maritime administrations, and therefore you should contact your administrations or relevant organizations that you are part of, and submit your work, because a good part of the success of the experience building phase is that we receive actually work like the Navison study that Sami alluded here, and experience from different member states and organizations. So I just like to take this broadcast minutes to express this note and to try to guide the workshop participants in their best efforts to contribute to the work of IMO. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. That's very helpful. So I just want to say thank you so much to Ricardo, to Manuel, to Sami, and also to Michelle, who had to leave. It's really been a privilege to moderate this discussion. I think we really explored, a lot of the nuance and a lot of the complexity that goes along with setting underwater noise targets. And I think we all learned a lot. I know I certainly did. So with that, I think, Doug, am I handing it back over to you?
Yes, Reagan, thank you very much. Brandon and I will attempt a wrap up here, but just before we get started with this sort of slides on that, I did want to say a huge thanks to you, Reagan, for moderating a wonderful job of integrating things and keeping things moving. And to our panelists, I think I can speak for Brandon. When we first started talking about Game On, God knows, maybe 6 or 8 or 10 years ago, that having that kind of discussion with that assemblage of people was really, I think, beyond our wildest dreams. And it's precisely, exactly the kind of dialogues that we wanted to encourage. And a huge thanks to Juliet and Molly for all of the support on the BOEM side. I also wanted to just say, slightly tongue in cheek, but quite sincere, that I feel, having worked in the Antarctic quite a lot, I always feel better when the Chilean Navy is on board and ready to help us. They rescue everybody. So
good to know.
But quite sincere. Thank you, Manuel. But quite sincerely, to hear from the geographic representation, the expertise representation, and the institutional representation, it really is great to hear everybody. And the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Brandon is that despite the chaos that's going on in the U.S. right now, rest assured that those of us who care about and want to work on this issue will continue to do so. Some of us are free to say more things than others, and believe me, we will continue to say them, and also to be here as resources. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brandon. We have just a couple of slides to wrap up, and as ever, encourage input and thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doug. And I certainly echo all of those thanks, and I won't repeat them, but just as you said, the kind of ideas and visions of these things, on this particular topic, going all the way back to that some of those early things that we mentioned, and seeing how the topic has matured, and the number of people that have stepped up, and the number of countries that have stepped up, and the international collaboration and partnership and thinking and constructive dialogue on this is really, really heartening and exciting, and especially on this topic, as really the biggest, broadest noise source in the ocean, and seeing the progress that's been made on is incredibly helpful. So I'm going to give what I really hope is just a kind of a highlight of themes without getting into detail in them. We have 20 minutes left, and I want to leave at least the last 10 minutes of it for next steps, which we'll circle back to Doug. But we just kind of tried tracking and building on the really fantastic summary that Michael gave of yesterday, which I also was pretty I found remarkable how good of a job that he did. So I'll probably go back and rewatch that part of it later. So I'm not going to try to get into detail in these things, but we just kind of highlighted some key topics and themes that came up that will get expanded and addressed and summarized with some of the amazing discussion that we had in the report. But a number of the things, including some of the VSR kind of approaches and the blue whales, blue skies, I think was one. But this came up in other topics of just the importance of like identifying synergies between different kinds of approaches that address different topics, noise correlation to emissions and efficiency in particular is one that came up in multiple themes. I know we've kind of addressed throughout the workshop the kind of the reasons why we want to identify particular thresholds and look at impacts and some of the challenges associated with that. I think one thing I wanted to emphasize is, that was hard when we started and at that Hamburg meeting of the Okeanos meeting of the engineers saying, like, what is the impact we're shooting for? What is that target? We know a lot more now than we did then in terms of the science behind how to evaluate those kind of impacts and those thresholds. And we actually have more information and more knowledge to go on to be able to identify and define those. It's not that there's not information with which to do that. It's that information is telling us that these things are probabilistic as opposed to, discrete numbers. And there's also the challenge of, if we want to look across multiple species, those distributions are not uniform, and they depend on these kind of differences. So that's why this kind of individual impact threshold has proved challenging, and why things like probability functions and other ways of thinking about this have been useful. And I think identifying in some of this discussion that the panel just had and that in the chat just had about the difference between targets and benchmarks, and I think the difference between thresholds and targets or benchmarks is an important one to identify. That while it may be challenging to identify a specific single numerical threshold for behavior or masking, that doesn't mean that having these specific and broader targets and then potential benchmark approaches is really useful. So I think there was some really good and productive discussion about specific quantitative vessel-based target approaches, which, as Michael described, have been, and in summary of the discussion yesterday, have been well established and proposed, developed, measured in some instances at the vessel level. And then some of these approaches that are either, that are biologically based, either at the species level, like we heard for the Puget Sound region and southern resident killer whales, or more by region, by ecosystem, I think are useful approaches. And it's probably not surprising and is productive that those are biologically based and more kind of broadly applied. Okay, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, there was a lot of useful discussion, and I won't try to rehash or go back into this, but the different kinds of approaches to incentivization for URN, and I think there's a lot to go on there, and I can see the section of the report that may incorporate some of that discussion and what those success stories are and where the challenges of some of those approaches. I think there was a lot of useful discussion there. I heard a fair bit of discussion of the need and the importance of consistent monitoring and measurements. I think it's important to note that those things are useful, informative, and ongoing in some places, but we do know enough now to as has been evidenced by the approaches that are being implemented. We don't have to wait for all of those answers to know that URN in particular places and ways and strategic approaches is needed, but those things are better informed, monitored, and kind of evaluated with baseline and ongoing kind of monitoring data that's happening in many places. And then kind of incorporating a whole bunch of different discussions and just trying to sort of simplify them, what was much of yesterday's presentation discussion in the panel today, that some of the national and international management or just overall approaches that incorporate concepts of target setting or benchmarking, deliberate efforts to do noise reduction, and quantitative evaluation of the efficacy of that are useful, and aspects that incorporate space, time, and the frequency overlap of sources as or in combination with impact threshold kind of approaches where those may make sense, especially with things like injury, and looking at more of a risk assessment, kind of cost benefit assessment. I think I heard some discussion and thought that those are useful approaches. Okay, that's a super high level summary of things, not to say that was all of what was discussed or that the report will follow all of those, but those were key topics that popped up to us. And why don't we flip it over to the next step slide, and I'll turn it back over to Doug.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brandon, and for all the work that's behind the scenes, just putting these things together as we go along. So what I would like to do is spend the next few minutes, and certainly we'll be watching the chat and the Q&A for people who have ideas and other input, is to talk about the next steps, both for what we just discussed the last two days, and then also for Game On in general. So we'll start with that. The first thing we'll do certainly is capture the workshop output, and Juliet's a professional at that, having done it for the other two workshops as well. So we'll all certainly capture all this, get as much as we can from the online recordings and things, and develop a report which will be freely available. And then on the concrete side of things, in terms of next steps and actions, we certainly want to support in whatever way we can, whether it's with writing or with contacts or numbers or whatever, and enable and develop a submission to the IMO, specifically to the Ship Design and Construction Subcommittee in January, to support the URN experience building phase agenda item that's highlighted, and highlighting the availability of the report. So we'll make that freely available. We'll get that out as soon as possible. I know there are other things that are coming up quicker, like in November, but we certainly will do that and look for additional input along the way. This doesn't have to be, nor is it really intended to be, just capturing exactly what was said in these 2 days, but as a report from all of us about these topics. And so it can be fed in, you can feed into it from various sources and other things. It doesn't just have to be a report of the meeting. And in that, and additionally, is this idea of considering benchmarks both for ambient and vessel specific, in relation to that submission I just discussed, or other relevant areas. And this is the other thing that we want to make sure that everybody knows, that these products, just because it says Game On it, doesn't mean anything other than we helped put it together with all of your assistance. And so we make that available freely to everybody, and as much support as we can muster and manage with the time. But for those benchmarks, as has been discussed, I won't walk through them. We've been through them, the Okeanos objectives, per vessel for retrofits or existing vessels, and then also for new builds. And I think we should not be shy about putting numbers out there. And with the ISO standards, it does make this a much more tractable thing to actually implement. And as Michelle, I think, said before she got off, if we have a measurement from Singapore, from Vancouver, from wherever, for a particular ship or ship class, that we take the words of who was it yesterday? I can't remember exactly, but said essentially, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and that we really take the advantage of this opportunity, and having had all of this input and all you folks online to really put these things into action. And then the final thing for us is thinking about what's next for Game On. Just to take a quick rewind, the first sort of organizing workshop was at IUCN, and I don't even remember what year it was. It doesn't really matter. But we set out this idea to have a series of workshops on specific noise sources and what the state of play was, what are the directions that it can go, and so on. And then the idea at the end of that was to have an in-person summit to synthesize those things, to take the lessons that we've identified that need to be learned, ones that have already been learned, and where we can go from there, in relevant fora, just like we're discussing, whether it's IMO or some other instrument. So we're at a point of thinking about where do we go next, and how do we continue to engage. There have been other groups that have formed in the interim, like the Monmare group of the international regulators. So continuing to work with them. There were a couple questions in the chat, some very fundamental questions about how do I make measurements in these things, and honestly, part of our vision early on was, if we could fund the money, would be to produce little recording devices that we could send around to people in areas that don't have the equipment, and be able to actually make the measurements that we could feed into these various discussions. So where to go next is a big question for us after we get through the reports and things that I've just described. And we look for input on that. We have our what we call our sounding board, and Brandon and I joke about being the blue chair and the green chair of Game On, instead of co-chairs or chair and assistant chair or whatever. And we can never remember who's blue and who's green, but it doesn't really matter. We want this to be an organic effort on everyone's part to contribute to this in whatever ways they can. So we have 7 minutes left, and I'm happy to open up. And I haven't been watching the chat closely right now, but are there things that have come in that we might want to consider in the context of next steps and approaches?
Doug, maybe I'll just say one, but maybe I'll just put one quick point on your last point there, to specifically ask people if they have feed that haven't been part of Game On, or that are just coming into it through this, like, or that have been part of the other ones. We are at this kind of turning point of what comes next, as Doug said. So I think we would take either, to the whole group or to us individually, or whatever feedback you have on, is this useful? How do we fit and complement spaces and not and amplify other people's efforts? That we've been deliberate to try to not, do things that are overlapping or redundant or competing with other things. We're trying to find spaces to amplify and help other things along on these issues. So any thoughts to that? And maybe just one thing for people that haven't known this before. Really, we had Game On is a labor of love for people. It's leveraged on other people's other jobs, right? So we've had a little bit of seed money to have a meeting and support a student for a couple of things, but it is largely a labor of love. So when we get we've had thoughts about do we do some kind of dedicated grants or foundation support or whatever. So anyway, we're largely leaning on other people's time through their other jobs, but we just appreciate any thoughts or input, because we are at this kind of like transitional time for the entity.
Yeah, exactly. And we've got the contact information for folks, which hopefully we will use in a very, very targeted and limited fashion. We assure you, one of those things would be to send reports around, as well as making them available on the Game On website. So, which I've just renewed for 3 years. So it'll be stable for at least that long, and the reports and things will be there. I think that's all I have. I'm happy to end a couple minutes early, but I do want to give a huge thanks and appreciation for the efforts of lots of people. Our initial sort of steering group, and what became the sounding board, And specifically, as I've said, it's Juliet and Molly, Jill Lewandowski, and a few others that aren't here today. I don't think I've seen Sonia Mendez, but we've very
Kathy Metcalf.
Kathy Metcalf. Absolutely, yeah. Thanks. Linwood Pendleton was a part of that original group. But again, it's been our aim to incorporate as many people as possible from across sectors, and I think we're doing okay in that. And having that panel today is clearly evidence of that. So I think with that, we're probably good to wrap up. Brandon, anything else? No. Okay. All right. Thank you all very much for hanging in there. And we're also look for feedback on this 2-day sort of arrangement of having time to sort of integrate things after for a panel discussion the second day. So, and apologies to anybody who's up in the middle of the night. Thank you for being there. All right, everyone. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day, night, whatever it is. Thanks for the applause. It's been really great. Appreciate it. Bye all.